You're listening to 100.5 FM in Vancouver, CFRO, Conscious Living Radio on Co-op. And of course, you're also in this moment watching on Facebook. The show then goes live on FM 6 to 7 Wednesday nights and also available as a podcast after the fact, www.consciousliving.radio.org. So today we are taking a look at how to be more non-judgmental, something I think we could all use a dose of. Our guest, Dr. Greg Hammer, MD, he's a professor at Stanford University of Medicine, pediatric intensive care physician, pediatric anesthesiologist, mindfulness expert, and author of the best-selling book, Gain Without Pain, The Happiness Handbook for Healthcare Professionals. He's also the chair of the Physician Wellness Task Force for the California Society of Anesthesiologists and visiting professor, lecturer on wellness at institutions worldwide. He advocates a mindfulness-based approach as well as the methodology he's come up with the acronym GAIN, which we'll hear about, focusing on the 4 pillars of gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment to promote wellness. So welcome to the show, Greg.
Great to be with you, Tasha.
We've spoken before when your book first came out. I'm curious, maybe you could define non-judgment, but also why did you pick the N in GAIN to focus on specifically these days?
Tasha, I think that really there are 4 pillars of happiness, and they are very much interrelated. And they are, as you suggested, gratitude. Gratitude is essential for happiness. We can all imagine that it's possible to be poor and happy or physically disabled and still happy, but you'll never see somebody who's ungrateful and happy. So gratitude is empirically one of the essential pillars of happiness. The A in GAIN stands for acceptance, and that really means that pain is an inevitable part of life. Just as there is joy in life, there is pain in life. We've all lost loved ones. We've all suffered, I think, the reverberations of global pain related to COVID and now what's happening in Ukraine. And so we need to discern what we can change and what we cannot change. And what we cannot change, we must accept and even embrace. And so that's part of the GAIN practice. And the I is for intention, and we can get into that perhaps during the hour, but our default mechanism of thinking, based on the way our brains have evolved through the millennia, is one, to be negative. We have a negativity bias. We tend to remember what's negative and forget about the positive in life. And so if we're going to be happy, we need to rewire our brains. If we don't do anything, if we just sort of relax into our default way of thinking, there's this negativity bias. There's this obsession with the past and the future and the difficulty being in the present moment, which is where happiness lives. Right. So that gets us to the N. Right. And really in no particular order of importance, but the N in GAIN, as you know, is for non-judgment. And it's really an essential part of happiness and being present.
I see how they're all woven together. You can't really do one without the other. How, though, do you see the difference between judgment and discernment?
That's an excellent question. Discernment is the process of differentiating one thing versus another thing, or appreciating the character of something as opposed to what is not the character. There's no need, as part of discernment, to render those differences as good or bad.
Right.
Whereas judgment, means that our brains are always comparing everything in our environment. We're very visual. We're hearing sounds. We're sizing things up. We're sizing people up. Perhaps most importantly and most harshly, we're sizing ourselves up, and we're judging others. We're comparing them to ourselves. We're comparing them to each other. And it's a basic way we think. I mentioned the negativity bias and the obsession with the past and future. It's also a basic way that we think to be judgmental, to be not only discerning, but taking it one step further and rendering opinions as to whether things are good or bad. He is better looking than I am. I'm smarter than she is. He's taller than the other guy. It's just something that's always churning in our minds. And really, the idea is if there's no benefit to rendering things good or bad. And when we do that, we see the world through an altered looking glass, if you will. In other words, we're casting a hue on what we see, what we observe, and our experience, instead of experiencing things the way they actually are.
And why are we wired that way? Because that really is universal. Is there a scientific reason? Is it the predators coming that we needed to look for danger? Is there something that actually explains why our brains are wired that way?
I have my own ideas. I don't think there's any scientifically proven reason that our brains have evolved that way. Most of our attributes, and those attributes of other living things as well, we can imagine why they developed that way. What's the Darwinian or selective advantage of particular characteristics or particular behaviors? I can imagine why we are totally distracted by the past and future, for example. And you mentioned the predator. I think, perhaps 50,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens was partly a cave dweller, and there may have been a saber-toothed tiger lurking outside the mouth of the cave. And here we are with our families sitting around a fire. We have a selective advantage if we are very wary of what may come, and perhaps even to cast a negative hue over that possibility and to catastrophize and think of the worst thing that may happen and therefore be prepared for it. That may have allowed us to live longer and to have more offspring. And so that trait of being very wary of what's to come had a selective advantage in a way and propagated through the population. And perhaps even the negativity bias, that way of thinking, similarly put us on edge and constantly provoked us to think about the worst thing, the most negative thing that might come to pass, so that we could avoid it. But the fact is that fast forward to 2022, we don't live in caves. Yeah. Most of us, most of the time anyway, we don't have that constant threat surrounding us, and yet our brains work as though we do. With regard to judgment, I don't know, Tasha. I think it's an excellent question. I think that something that I've observed, which is almost a universal human trait, is that we judge ourselves very harshly, and we suffer because of that. And perhaps we compare ourselves to others as a result of that. And we judge ourselves poorly. And when we really want to pile it on in terms of our negative self-judgment, we have thoughts of how this other person is better than I am, or smarter than I am, or so on. Or at other times, we may want to defend our egos because we're feeling insecure, and react in the opposite manner by saying, I'm smarter than this person, or trying to demonstrate that I have more physical prowess than this person. So I think it's a great question. I'd love to talk to an anthropologist who's perhaps thought a lot more about how our brains evolved to be so judgmental. But these are just some of the ideas I have. I think the bottom line is, here we are, and we are constantly evaluating our environment and judging elements in the environment, other people, and ourselves. And unfortunately, we judge ourselves very harshly.
So the repercussions of living in that state of judgment and comparison, can you kind of touch on that for us?
Well, let's think for a moment about something that one of my true heroes said in defining mindfulness, and that's Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, who I think is one of the founders of what we call mindfulness,
Mhm.
if you will. And he defined mindfulness as the awareness of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And I think this means, or at least it's a reference to, that happiness lives in the present moment. If we think of all of our happiest moments, walking through the forest, looking up at the canopy of the tall trees, seeing the sunlight filter through those leaves, marveling at the age of these beautiful, majestic redwood trees or whatever other type of tree they may be. We're not thinking about what happened yesterday or what's to come tomorrow. We're really in the present moment. And that really is the only moment that we ever truly experience. The past and the future are just a collection of thoughts.
Can I throw
And
something in? Sorry, I know I'm interrupting.
absolutely.
But to the unconscious, which is where that seething cauldron of all kinds of goodies lives, that can be experienced in the present. That's the only place, actually. Otherwise, all of it's experienced in the present. So I hear you talking about that beautiful, pristine moment where you're at one with nature or whatever. But what about the inclusion of all these other parts that aren't so necessarily harmonious or pretty? Can they not also be accepted at the same time? Is it not vital that they are, actually? I think is my question to you.
Well, I think that we need to accept, that's the A in gain, those things that represent pain, those ways that represent the way the world fails to comport with our apparent wants and needs. So we do need to open our arms and open our hearts and bring those things in and accept them. But when we are truly present, if you think about the times when you've truly not even had a thought about what happened an hour ago or yesterday or last week or
Right.
what's going to happen in 15 minutes or an hour or a day or a week, those times when you are very present, you are happy. You're really in a state of bliss, whether that is, for example, laughing hysterically with a friend, where your laughter is so intense, it's out of control, and you look at each other and you are not thinking about anything other than whatever it was that made you laugh. And you are just in a state of bliss. Or you're making love with somebody that you adore and that you're very close to. You're not really thinking about anything other than the present moment at those best of times, or the walk in the forest or other experience in nature. And so if happiness lives in the present moment, why are we not more present? And how can we bring our awareness into the present moment? And as Dr. Kabat-Zinn said, we do that by being intentional with our thought processes and doing that without judgment. And I think the intention, as I said, is so important because our brains have evolved in such a way that the default way of thinking is not being present. It's analyzing something that happened in the past and doing so with a negative bias that brings us shame, embarrassment, regret, low self-esteem. So when we are feeling those things, when we are having those thoughts, if we are attuned and we've been doing our gain practice, a light bulb goes off and reminds us that these negative thoughts are not based on anything real. They're just a collection of thoughts, and this is the way our brain operates. Let's now bring the focus back to the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally.
What if you did all that and included the feelings? Because I'm not talking about thoughts. I'm talking about the feeling that might exist. I guess the one place I'm kind of poking a little bit is happiness to me could include a feeling at the same time that I am content and joyful and open and happy that is not that. In other words, it's accepting all parts of me, including perhaps the part that's sad. It's not a contradiction to me to include the feeling state of other parts that might be having a little hallucination from the past. But if you're having it now and you're actually doing the gain method, so you're embracing all of that, I guess it's not necessarily a blissful state, but it's a state of oneness with oneself that could have multiple feelings in it. And that to me is happiness, actually. The inclusion is the happiness. So I guess that's what I was kind of going. I have difficulty when people paint a picture and go, it has to look like this, which is all positive, because my experience isn't that. My experience would include it all. And I'm trying to go, how does that work in your understanding?
Well,
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Tasha.
Okay.
And I fully agree with you. And that's why the A in GAIN is acceptance.
Yeah.
And there
Right.
is a formula in the book: suffering equals pain times resistance. So
Right.
we have inevitably pain in life.
Right.
We lose a parent, we lose a child, we lose a loved one. This represents pain. However, if we open our arms and open our hearts and embrace that pain and
Right.
fully accept it, then our resistance goes to zero, the resistance being the opposite of acceptance. And so back to the formula, suffering equals pain times resistance. If the resistance is zero or the acceptance is complete, there's still the pain, but our suffering vanishes. And
Right.
that is
Bliss to
describing
me.
yeah, I mean, it is. It's a state
It
of
is.
peace.
Yeah.
I don't know who said this, but I love the statement that peace is happiness at rest and happiness is peace in motion.
Say it again.
Let's say happiness is peace in motion.
Uh-huh.
Peace is happiness at rest.
Oh, interesting.
So I think in that moment of complete acceptance, we've embraced the pain. We've opened our heart to it. We've merged with it. There's no separation. If we ask ourselves the question, can I live with this pain forever? The answer is yes. Our suffering diminishes, and that represents a state of peace, complete acceptance. And peace is happiness at rest.
Isn't there an for that to exist? There's an identification piece where you say, I'm having this, I'm not this. I have this pain, I'm not the pain, right? In mindfulness, you're tapped into something that is so much bigger than your personal mythology. And that, I think, also brings a sense of expansiveness that lets you hold whatever comes up with the acronym. Do you know what I mean?
I agree with you completely, Tasha. I think we're describing that sense of complete acceptance.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really want to get into some of the how-tos for our listeners. And you mentioned earlier, you talked about that self-critical, I've seen so many people and experienced it myself where you're wrestling with like this inner critic, this saboteur inside. And even if you consciously have done a ton of work and you're going, okay, I'm not going to believe this judgment, it still is, you can't just make it go poof. Exactly. So I want to talk about that process for people. How do you get in a position where you realize you don't have to be hostage to your inner critic, to that saboteur, to that judging mind inside?
I think the first step, Tasha, is to understand the way our brains work and to understand that we all have a negativity bias. And we all have this obsession with the past and the future. So the first step is simply that awareness. We're not alone. This is the way our brains have evolved as a species. And simply that awareness that we're not alone is liberating. So that's the first step, is just to recognize the way we are, the way our brains work. This does not define us. But this is the way our brains have evolved over millennia. Mm-hmm. And that awareness is a relief, I think. Whenever I discuss this with people, I can see the smile on their face. I can see a sense of relief that, I've been trying to hide this secret away, that I have these negative thoughts, that I'm harshly self-judgmental, that I am afraid of what's going to happen next. And when they hear that all of us think this way, I think there's a sense of relief. So I think that's the first thing is, and again, this goes to the dissolution of self-judgment, because this is not something we should be ashamed of. This is not something that we bear ourselves alone. This is the way the human species has evolved. This is the way our brains have evolved. So step one is recognition. And then I think we also have to appreciate that our brains developed this way over tens of thousands of years, and we're not going to change the way our brains work in a day or a week. And so having a set of expectations that is realistic, we're going to just take baby steps, just no expectation, in fact. And that means no judgment, no self-judgment. There is no failure. This is a process. And there's nothing negative about it, no matter what. If you're committed to doing your 3-minute gain meditation every morning and you skip a few days, there's no room for self-judgment. There's no self-blame. There's no negative outlook toward that occurrence. So, but let's just commit to a practice that will help rewire our brains. It's a miracle that our brains have this quality called neuroplasticity. So yes, our brains have evolved in ways that tend to veil or obscure our true nature, which is happiness. But the good news is our brains are malleable. And at any point in life, at any age, we can rewire our brains, but it's going to take time. It's a process of baby steps. And in fact, there's no destination. All there is the process. So first step is recognition that our brains work this way and that we're not alone. And the second step is that there's good news, that we have this magical quality of neuroplasticity, and we can rewire our brains a little bit at a time with a daily practice. And so to me, that means getting up in the morning, opening the blinds, doing your morning hygiene, finding a quiet place to sit for 3 minutes. And during this 3 minutes, we're going to get in touch with our breath. We're going to feel the air entering our body through our nose, going down into our chest, expanding our body. And then how effortless it is to let that breath go. And we're going to slow this process down. That actually suppresses the secretion of adrenaline in our body, slowing down our breathing. With this conscious breathing, slows our heart rate, lowers our blood pressure. So we're going to do that for a few cycles of breathing. And then we're going to actually contemplate that for which we're grateful. And we all have so much for which to be grateful. I, right now, Tasha, am grateful for the opportunity to see your smiling face again and to have a conversation with you. I'm grateful for the loved ones in my life. I'm grateful for the privilege of serving and helping children and their families. All of us have much for which to be grateful. And then we're going to transition to that there's pain in life, and we're going to actually imagine something painful, and we're going to imagine bringing that closer and closer, opening our chest, literally opening our heart, bringing the pain inside our heart, embracing it with our heart, and with our breath, feeling a sense of peace that we can live with this. And then as we get back in touch with our breath, we move to intention. For me, the first thing on my intention list is to be present. So I take that opportunity to listen to the sounds I'm hearing. It could be the jet plane flying overhead in the distance, just with that sort of crescendo, decrescendo sound. That's not very loud, but I can hear it. And feeling the tingling sensation on the bottom of my feet, and feeling the sensation of the earth kind of supporting me. And then I transition my intention to being positive. So again, this is related to gratitude, and it's related to the intention of rewiring my brain to be more present and more optimistic, more positive. And then I transitioned to non-judgment. And for me, I'll tell you what I think about often during this phase of my gain meditation. I imagine this beautiful NASA photograph of the Earth apparently suspended in space. And I'm looking at this beautiful blue planet, a little bit of cloud cover, some little land masses there. And the planet is neither good nor bad. Mm. It's so obvious to me. It's not anything to be judged in one way or another. It's simply there in all of its, majestic presence. It's neither good nor bad. And then I transitioned to thoughts of myself, because if the earth is neither good nor bad, it just simply is what it is. Mm. It's only logical for me to think of myself in the same way. Mm. I am neither good nor bad. I am just what I am. And so I repeat that to myself. I am neither good nor bad. I am simply what I am. And then I say to myself, I am. And this is linked to my breath again, the majesty and the beauty of that slow, intentional breath. And then I just focus on the breath for a couple of cycles and then slowly open my eyes. And I'm ready to go out in the world, and I'm ready to embrace these four principles throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And so this can take as little as 3 minutes. And I've just rewired my brain a little bit. And so what I've experienced and what I've discussed with others who have practiced this very simple method, when weeks and months go by, we can look back and acknowledge, wow, I really have started to think differently. And that's really our goal, is to engage in this process. Right. Baby steps, a little bit at a time, hopefully daily. And it's miraculous, the change, the neuroplasticity and the way we can change the way we think.
And, I'm a very auditory person. So what I say inside my head is so important to me. And I'll find key phrases when I notice a pattern that of perception that has not been working and does not fit any kind of value system that I want to have. And I'll just find the phrase that blows it out of the water and relax into it, like you did your I am. I remember going through a period where I literally, because I could see I was wired to see danger. And it was, I had to say, the war is over. Now, I didn't go through the war, but I could feel it systemically coming through my ancestors and my mother's experience. And I realized I was literally wired to perceive, as I think everyone is on some level or another, danger. And so the war is over, like there is no war. It became very present, and a phrase that for me was essential. I think their self-talk can be an incredibly great tool if you find the right words that are personal to you. Does that?
Absolutely. That's beautiful. And I love the way you said that you feel the pain of your ancestors' experience.
Yeah.
And I think we all do. I think we all feel the background reverberation of the way we've treated each other as a race, the way we extracted Africans from their home culture and their families and put them in the holds of ships and took them to the West Indies, to North America, to Europe and the UK, and treated them like cattle or worse. That pain reverberates today. Mm-hmm. Events that are happening far away in the world reverberate and affect all of us. I think daily about what's happening in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. To me, it feels like, what if the United States attacked Canada? And I know you're in Canada, but what if without provocation we decided we should annex Canada?
Yeah.
Or a part of Canada, and we started attacking it and bombing it and bombing schools and hospitals and intentionally killing innocent people. this is what it feels like to me, what's happening in Ukraine right now. It's beyond belief. But I think that instead of resisting that pain and therefore increasing my own suffering equals pain times resistance. Instead of trying not to think about it,
right?
There are times and a place for this, of course. I don't propose that we think about painful experiences all the time. But when we find that we're trying to deal with a painful issue by pushing it away, I think there's a message there, and we need to sit with it. We need to open our hearts and bring it in, merge with it, and accept it fully.
Yeah.
And this is the key to diminishing our suffering.
Yeah. No, that's really important. I remember with the Ukraine piece, because it's so similar to what my mom went through in Poland with World War II, where suddenly, someone's banging at your door and you're thrown in a cattle car and you're in a Siberian concentration camp. It was like the same. And people didn't seem to know about that. Everybody knew about the German invasion, but they didn't understand that the Russians came at the same time. And so my mom happened to go that way. Her dad went, the Germans had him. But the experience was so, I would watch the news and I literally felt for sure a collective kind of pain of the suddenness and the unfairness and how life changes like that on a dime, and innocent people are put in a situation that they're helpless in. So opening to that feeling of helplessness wasn't fun. It's not fun. You feel a lot, but ultimately it creates a kind of compassion, that degree of not being afraid of it. And acceptance, I think, creates more compassion and perhaps inspires us to do things that can help. Whereas if you're in denial of it, I don't know, we're so isolated. Maybe we can touch on that too, just how isolated people can get if we're not, the answer is not, let's not look at the news, because you can't shut down from what's happening globally. We are one here, and what's happening is impacting, as you said, all of us. So finding a way to be with it that is helpful and perhaps can inspire action, I think is so important. You said something interesting. I think I read in one of I think it was an article. I'm not sure if it was in the book. Maybe it was in the book. You said transformation. You talked about doing, and do you remember the quote I'm trying to dig up? Transformation. Action is. Oh, darn.
I wish I could help you there,
yeah,
Tasha.
You can't, but it's connected to this. That one is, it's in the doing. So it's not just knowledge of this is bad, or, transformation isn't knowledge, it's action. It turns into action. I think that's what you said.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's the same here. The feeling isn't the answer to sit there and just feel the pain, but if you can turn it into some kind of inspired action that actually has a ripple effect, I see that as hugely exciting and unifying, actually, in this process.
I'm curious as to, I don't know is your mother still with us?
Yeah. She's completely blind by herself. So when it was all happening, her memory started kicking in. All she had was the radio to hear.
And how does she feel about the Russian people now?
She never, ever held anything against the Russian people. Even then, she would say, she was in the camp and she'd say, if you told a Russian a sad story, they'd cry. Like that was her experience, like that, meaning the people in the village would give you a potato peel if you were starving. So it wasn't the people that she ever felt anything negative about. Somehow she knew that at 9.
Well, we started talking about non-judgment, and there's a beautiful example of non-judgment.
Right.
It would be totally understandable if she had a lot of animosity, not just toward the Russian leadership, but toward Russian people. It's very common for us to harbor these feelings of resentment and judgment against those who may or may not have had any involvement, but who are from a country that has somehow done us wrong. So, my ancestors were Jews, and many of them were put in concentration camps, etc. And it's, I think sometimes about how they must have felt about German people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your mother, not surprisingly to me for some reason, exemplifies compassion, forgiveness, and non-judgment. And that is so important because it's easy to see how judging a population that was somehow responsible for imprisoning a family member or ourself would lead to enhanced suffering.
Right.
You know, this judgment is a form of resistance. It's, for example, resisting the truth that, in fact, almost every Russian person is a human being and a potential friend. But trying to depersonalize a population is a way of resisting. And forgiveness, compassion, and non-judgment represent the opposite. And you can see how the former, resistance and judgment, represent suffering on the part of the judger.
Yeah.
Whereas forgiveness, compassion, and non-judgment represent a freedom, and that acceptance represents peace. Right. And these are easy concepts to digest. And so therefore, let's bring those to fruition in our own lives. Well, in small ways and big ways.
And the understanding, like when I think of Viktor Frankl and that whole visual of, you know, people, the one thing that could not be taken away is that joy inside, you know, even as you're moving to a gas chamber, like it's so horrific and intense. So surely, to me, it's like, surely we can do better with, you know, whatever we're going through when you come,
yes.
You know, I don't want to compare again, but it's like in any situation, you could actually step up and be that light, be that model of embracing peace, even in such a horrific scenario. And I think that's for my mom, that for sure has been true. And I know that that's something I inherited, a desire to be able to do, even in the face of whether it's death or anything else. That it's the question, instead of why is this happening to me? What is this for? And in the moment, in the present moment, because there is no answer, what is this for, if you look at it as cause and effect. But if you look in this, when you're in that state, that mindful state, and you ask the question, wow, the answers you get are quite profound and rippling. They do ripple out and facilitate a better world, even a tragic or awful event.
So true.
Yeah.
And if you think about the people that we consider to be most enlightened, the Dalai Lama or the Buddha or Jesus, they've all, they share a historic persecution. And having to endure pain that was brought upon them by others. So, of course, the Dalai Lama being essentially in exile from his home in Tibet. I think of Jesus on the cross with stakes through his hands and feet. The pain was there for sure. It's not difficult to imagine how much pain he must have been experiencing, but my sense is that he lowered his resistance to zero. He fully accepted what was happening, and therefore his suffering dissipated. And I think that's acceptance of the pain, but it's also non-judgment of his persecutors. It's letting go of that judgment, good or bad, of others, and just seeing them and seeing the world as it truly is,
right,
without the overtones of our judgments. And that is a very resonant, peaceful experience.
And powerful. Like there's a sense of power in that, because you couldn't do that if you were, that's not a victim statement. It's the exact opposite. It's an empowered, it's huge what you just described, right? even
Yes.
though you could look at that and say he's being victimized, but that's not the energy there. It's out so far beyond that, which I guess brings us a bit to forgiveness. Do you have some thoughts on forgiveness and what can facilitate it being an easier process for some people who might be stuck a little bit in the persecutor victim dynamic?
Sure. Well, I'm fortunate enough to have Dr. Fred Luskin as a dear friend, and he co-wrote the chapter on forgiveness and compassion in that first book, The Game Without Pain. And I think that forgiveness and compassion, to me, put most simply, means letting go of maladaptive thoughts of the past. And, we all have had painful experiences. And it's a natural process to judge others as being responsible for having caused us pain. And as long as we cling to those thoughts, we are fortifying this maladaptive way of thinking about the past and also forming judgments. And clearly, the GAIN approach is to bring yourself back to the present moment, start with the breath, focus on your gratitude, focus on accepting that painful experience, which is no longer present unless we make it so.
Right.
That's something that's in the past that will bring us suffering in the present if we so choose. Right. So we really have a choice as to whether we're going to keep that pain front and center. We need to ask ourselves, is it adaptive or maladaptive to be thinking of that painful experience and blaming the other person?
The blaming, for sure, we got to drop. But I will, again, for me, the helpful piece has been to say a part of me feels whatever it is, because the part of me that's saying a part of me is not that part. Do you know, in that moment, it just helps me feel authentic, not like I'm trying to do something and whitewash something that was extremely painful. I'm including it and going, a part of me feels da da da, because it's making it, there's a meaning in there too. Like it actually uncovers, because I'm making it mean, or that part of me is making it mean that, I don't know, whatever the meaning is. As soon as I name what is going on inside, I can let go. But if I don't include it, I feel fake. I feel like I'm pushing something down that has its own little life force and wants to be heard. And so that little piece for me makes all the difference to then move into, it's acceptance, but then it moves into, it just dissolves because it's not real. It's not, like, as you say, where I'm keeping it alive. I'm the one who's in that moment throwing the sticks on the bonfire, if the bonfire's the pain, right?
Yeah, well, that pain and judgment of the other person is simply a collection of thoughts.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think as long as that's bubbling up and bringing you a bunch of thoughts that represent resistance or depersonalizing the other person, if it's a matter of an interaction that you had with somebody else, depersonalization is something we often do. It's a form of resistance. It's a form of morphing something into a version that comports with our apparent wants and needs, and not actually seeing it and fully accepting it as it actually is.
Right.
And that is, I think, central to forgiveness and compassion. If we can see things as they actually are. And that includes seeing other people without judgment. People who may have trespassed upon you, people who may have judged you or treated you poorly are themselves suffering. And they're responding out of a sense of pain themselves.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be acting that way.
Right.
People who are grateful, accepting, intentional, and non-judgmental don't mistreat other people. People who are unhappy, ungrateful, resisting, defaulting to the most negative aspects of their negativity bias, those are the people that are doing harm to others and most of all themselves. And so being compassionate and forgiving those people is accepting that pain that we experienced as a result of that interaction or whatever the thing is. So I fully agree with you that we need to go back to it, use it in our gain practice when we're on the A for acceptance. If we're feeling hostility towards someone else, identify that pain while we're breathing and in this state of contemplation. Identify the pain and bring it closer until we fully accept it. Then we don't have to think about it anymore.
Mm-hmm. I love it. So we've only got a couple of minutes. Let's tell people where they can get your book, because that's where you've got a 30-day challenge in there, which you touched on a bit with the 3-minute. I mean, 3 minutes is nothing. Everybody's got 3 minutes a day. If you knew at the end of 30 days, there would be an impact in how you think and that your life would feel radically different, I think everyone would say yes to the 3 minutes. So give them your challenge and tell them where they can get the book.
Well, I will refer briefly to a practice called 3 Good Things. This goes to intention, but there's a study out of Duke University that tens of thousands of people enrolled in. It's a survey. Take a survey, and then you pledge to this practice where you think of and ideally write down 3 positive things that happened to you during the day before you go to sleep. And what the investigators have shown is that little simple practice that practically takes no time at all. Do it while you're turning down your bed.
Yeah.
Think of 3 good things that happened today. Well, today I had a wonderful walk with my dog. Today I had a great conversation with Tasha. Today I had a plate full of fresh food. Think about those 3 things. And what the investigators discovered is that it helped people sleep and it made them happier. So the 30-day challenge, in keeping with 3 good things, would just be instead to use the GAIN principles to sit down for 3 minutes, close your eyes in the morning, get in touch with your breath, transition your focus of your thoughts from gratitude to acceptance, intention, and non-judgment. Go back to the breath, slowly open your eyes, make a pledge to embrace these principles during the day when things came up, when somebody cuts you off on the road and you start to form all these judgments.
Right.
Have a laugh at yourself. Remember, you did your GAIN meditation and the end is non-judgment, and drop those judgments.
Yeah.
If you do that for 30 days, even for 3 minutes every morning, I can guarantee that you'll look back and realize that you're already starting to think differently.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's really been fun. And again, links, I guess, to your website, or Mark has put them up on consciousliving.org. Any final words? Anything you want to say before we wrap up?
I can just say that it's been a pleasure, Tasha, and I'm so happy to be with you again, and feel free to dial me up anytime.
Well, thank you. And this interview again is going to air on FM radio 100.5, Co-op Radio CFRO in Vancouver, Wednesday night, 6 to 7 p.m. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm Tasha Simms. Mark Caron in the background. You pop back in, Mark. And we've been speaking with Dr. Greg Hammer.